The media has a new excuse for why they didn't cover the Wuhan lab leak or Wuhan lab accident, or why they claim that such an accident wasn't possible and why COVID absolutely had a natural origin. And if you've been paying attention, you're probably familiar with this new excuse. And the new excuse is we were duped. And exactly the same thing happened in Russiagate, where you had, for instance, Michael Isikoff, the guy who kind of kicked it off on the media side with the Carter Page story back in September of 2016, and Trump-Russia collusion, and all of that, of course, sourced to the Steele dossier. Well, years later, he said, "Oh, I was duped. I believe that." And we had the FBI was duped. That's what came out in the Durham cases, and of course, none of that is true. And so it is now as well. So now you have this guy, Don McNeil from the New York Times. Well, he was the COVID reporter. He's no longer there for other reasons. Well, during COVID, he was there. And of course, he was part of the cover up as well. But now he says, no, he was duped. Fauci's scientists, Christian Andersen and so on, they duped him. And that's why he didn't report about this stuff. And of course, that is absolute and total nonsense.
Yeah, there's kind of two elements to this, because first of all, you have the actual researchers themselves, the Fauci-funded scientists, and we're talking about people like Christian Andersen, Robert Gary, et cetera. And we know by their own words that they were admitting that this thing looked natural, that it looked like it had been lab engineered, it was man-made. And we then have their Slack channel communications where they were embarking upon the creation of the natural origin, or the proximal origin, which promoted the natural origin narrative. And they more or less openly admit in those communications that, yeah, they knew that it was actually a lab leak, but they couldn't really say that, and they were going to go in this direction instead. So you could hang them by their own words if you had a media that was actually honest, because almost nobody knows about that information, and it's hard to get it widespread. And then you have what's going on over, like the New York Times, and claiming that they're duped, and we didn't have the ability to have the proper information to know that maybe it was a different origin. It's such a lie. The intelligence community used that against us as well, claiming that without China's cooperation, you weren't going to be able to get to the bottom to answer that question. What was the true origin for COVID without China's cooperation? That's patently false. They've used it time and again as a band-aid, as an excuse. But both you and I know full well, as people who've investigated this and, for years and have worked with virologists in terms of understanding the technical aspects, you don't need China's cooperation. There is plenty of evidence to determine where this came from. And so this idea that, that they were fooled, it's again, just another easy cover up to make up for the fact that they ran cover for the intelligence community all along to this point. Now, as the narrative begins to shift out in the public and people aren't ready to believe that so easily, we were fooled and we're on your side. Well, maybe they're not pretending to be on our side, but, they're now accepting a narrative and it wasn't their fault. It was their fault.
It certainly was. And the beautiful thing about this particular instance is that we can prove it. Like with Michael Isikoff, I don't think we can prove that just because we can't get into his mind, right? We cannot prove that he was not duped by Christopher Steele, that he's so, I don't believe it for a moment, but in terms of actually proving it, it's always difficult proving what goes on in someone else's mind. But this time it's different. In this case, it's different because we can absolutely prove that the New York Times is lying when they're now claiming that they were duped. So the basic story is that they, after Fauci's secret teleconference, February 1st, which of course was kind of kicked off by an article in in Science magazine.
John Cohen.
Right, which through a link sort of got you somewhere where you might ask questions about a possible lab accident. Now, Cohen's purpose was not to expose that, but anyway, if you click the links, you could get there. And anyway, for maybe it was that article, maybe it was something else, but something triggered the New York Times to sort of want to inquire about that, or want to look into it. Maybe it was DIC, as you mentioned, like a preemptive cover-up. And here's the first clue. Whom did they talk to? And that is sort of the first huge clue. They went to talk to Fauci's scientists. The New York Times went to Christian Andersen, he was the lead author on the proximal fraud paper, which is supposedly called proximal origin, but that's what I call it. Total fraud, that paper. Fauci instigated paper to cover up the lab origin and to push the discussion into natural origin, and hugely successful. One of the most cited papers of all time. All the media, lapped it up. Everyone was like, "Oh yeah, great." So the first clue is the New York Times went to talk to those people, and as you say, from their private messages, we know, and this is part of the proof, that they were laughing about the New York Times guy behind the scenes, privately saying, we're going to lie to him. We're going to not tell him what the real story with COVID is. We're just going to tell him it's natural and that's the end of it. And Christian Anderson even brags to the other proximal fraud people that he inserted like smiley faces to make it all sound innocent. And he says, this got nothing to do with labs or whatever, little smiley face. And so this was an elaborate, if childish, scheme to cover things up and to lie to the New York Times guy. So you might say, okay, maybe the New York Times is just so mired in its ways, so establishment, that they would only talk to like Fauci scientists. They never thought of talking to anyone else. It's only these ivory tower, that. But here's the second part of the proof, the one that makes it airtight. At exactly the same time that these Fauci scientists were lying to the New York Times, demonstrably, provably, at exactly the same time, Richard E. Bright, a professor from Rutgers, who is highly qualified in these exact same topics, he had in fact warned about the Wuhan lab and its activities, and he had warned that there might be a pandemic coming out of that lab. He had specifically warned that. So Richard E. Bright was also emailing that same reporter with the New York Times, telling him the exact opposite story, namely with copious links and information about a lab leak, like this, and this. We can show it here. So that proves that the New York Times was not duped. It proves that the New York Times had, at a minimum, two sides of the story and decided to ignore the other side of the story. And I completely agree. So I love the fact that we can absolutely prove that this "we were duped" excuse is absolute bullshit. I love that. But I also think you are absolutely right that this was essentially IC-led. Someone told the New York Times, like, talk to those people. And by the way, those people were also sent to talk to Congress. They were also sent to talk to the, other, I think they talked to the FBI and whatever. Like Fauci sent these people, the NASM, of course, the National Academy of Sciences. Fauci sent his little, cabal to talk to all these people. But Fauci didn't send them to the New York Times. We know from the emails that the New York Times came to them. And I agree with you. That must have been intelligence community telling that, hey, talk to those guys.
And there's more problems too, because in terms of who would be considered the more, more of an expert in these matters. Well, Christian Anderson wasn't even had anything to do with coronaviruses, career-wise. He actually added that to his biography later on to make it look like he did, but he didn't. Richard Ebrard, by contrast, has this incredible resume. If you were to look at the two people on paper, there's no question as to who you would consider to be the more preeminent, the more trustworthy. Maybe that's not even the right word. Let's take trust out of it for a moment. And just in terms of who would be the person that you would think would be the more credible person to speak to, Ebrard would win hands down. And to make matters worse, it's not just us saying that. The FBI in the early days of the COVID outbreak went to Richard Ebrard to get his expertise. And that led them to open an investigation of EcoHealth. So, how the New York Times even got to Christian Anderson anyway, that seems pretty suspect to begin with. It feels like they got pointed in that direction. But if you had two competing voices in that conversation, it is impossible that if you were starting out with honest motives, that you wouldn't elevate whatever Richard Ebrard was saying far over anything Christian Anderson was saying. And you don't have to trust us for that because the FBI felt exactly the same way.
Or if you just go back to February 1st, 2020, and you were a reporter, an honest reporter, and tried to find someone to talk to, Ebrard would be there. He just did some searches. Okay, I'm just going to search here for whom could I talk to about, what might have happened at the Wuhan lab. You'd come up with names like Ralph Barrick would come up on that list.
Yeah.
Strangely, no one talked to him, right? Ebrard would be on that list. Christian Anderson would, as you mentioned, he would not be on that list. And this kind of brings us to a wider point. The two people who took the lead on proximal fraud, Anderson and another guy called Eddie Holmes. And by the way, they were also the lead kind of presenters on Fauci's secret teleconference, where they started initiating the cover-up. Those two guys, by their own admission, didn't know much about this stuff. You already talked about Anderson. Guess what Holmes did? When it came time to determine the order in which they put the names of the authors on the proximal fraud paper, Holmes emailed these other guys. That's an email that just came out recently. And said, hey, I kind of feel embarrassed being on this at all because I don't really understand it. And that's his words, not ours, right? So what are the chances that not only the New York Times would talk to the people who by their own admission don't know much, but that Fauci would recruit those people to be the leading, scientists on this issue when they're demonstrably not? This is a ginormous cover-up, and it was instigated from somewhere. And I mean, you asked, how did the New York Times get to Anderson? Completely agree with you. That just makes no sense unless they were told to. And then, of course, the next step is, how did Fauci get to Anderson? How did Fauci get to Holmes? How did Fauci get to Robert Gary? How did that happen?
Well, I actually think I might have the answer to that question. And that would take me back to the Kanema lab that was operating in Africa when the Ebola outbreak hit. Because who were the people? There's a lot of reasons to think that the Ebola outbreak came out of the Kanema lab. It's kind of the same scenario like COVID, where the outbreak happened thousands of miles away from the actual natural origin or possibility for the virus. First time Zaire, the virus, had ever emerged in any sort of population outside of the Congo. And the Kanema lab was working with, they initially denied they were working with the Ebola Zaire virus. We know they were working with Lassa, the Lassa virus. Anderson himself later admitted that that lab was indeed working with the Ebola Zaire virus. The reason that I mentioned Anderson there is because he and Robert Gary, two co-authors on proximal fraud, the proximal origin paper, were the two people who were running the Kanema lab. And when the outbreak happened, who were the two people to run point on trying to prove why it couldn't have come out of the Kanema lab? Christian Anderson and Robert Gary. So they've been through this before. That question never got answered. By the way, I'm all but convinced that the Ebola outbreak in Africa came out of the Kanema lab. I can't prove it, but I'm far and away not the only person who thinks that. A lot of scientists, credible scientists, believed that at the time. So, what do those guys have in common? Well, they have experience in common. Not experience with coronaviruses, but they have experience in running cover for a lab leak. And, those are the same parties that were brought in to run cover for the coronavirus leak.
And of course, those two guys, Anderson and Gary, also had grants sitting on Fauci's desk, which still needed to be signed off on. So just in case they didn't quite get the message in terms of the Kanema lab and what they were expected to write, that made sure that they would, in terms of the huge conflict of interest. How can you, especially on Fauci's part, all sides, but Fauci's part, how can you be in charge of signing off on grants worth many, many millions, and at the same time tell the people who are expecting those grants or are hoping to get those grants to write a paper to according to your favored theory, or in terms of pushing the cover up? It's just absolutely mind-boggling. And once more, this is just so tiresome and so frustrating. 4 years later, no one knows about this. The media doesn't talk about it. The cover-up just goes on and on and on. And this gets me back to the New York Times, right? Just if there's any doubt whatsoever that they were not duped and that they are part of the cover-up and that they were part of this whole cabal that pushed a false narrative, to this day, the New York Times has not reported on those Slack messages from these proximal frauds, Anderson and so on. If it's really true that their reporter was duped 4 years ago, and these messages, by the way, they came out a year ago, so the New York Times had a year to report on these things. If they were really duped, wouldn't the New York Times then report, hey, by the way, back, when COVID started, we talked to these scientists, but they duped us, and here's the evidence, and we can prove it because they were discussing it privately, how they were lying to us? And isn't that a newsworthy story, especially if you report it falsely? Remember the New York Times had that big piece where they completely tore into Tom Cotton for deigning to mention the Wuhan lab. How dare you? You're a conspiracy theorist and whatever. The fact that the New York Times to this day has not reported about any of this just proves beyond any doubt that they are part of this false narrative and they were not duped.
Yes, in a knowing fashion. Exactly so. You know, you one of the things that you did touch on is the grant process and how and the fact that there weren't these disclosures. You know, that was a repeated pattern, the non-disclosure, the conflict of interest issues. Peter Daszak, Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, all of these people Hotep, what Peter
Peter Hotez, yeah.
Hotez. None of these people disclosed their massive conflicts of interest when they would put out papers supporting the position of a natural origin. They all refused to. Ultimately, it came out, and Peter Daszak, I think they finally had to issue kind of a minor retraction, but it was only by, you know, being dragged kicking and screaming to doing so. So they all tried to hide any involvement that they had. And then as far as the grant process goes, that's a huge ongoing problem. And it still bothers me that this article that you and I wrote didn't get the full attention that it deserved. It was fairly widely read, but not enough. And that was on the fact that the people that were put in place to create the natural origin, ultimately, it took us a long time of digging through the grant processes, but what did we find? $50 million paid out to these individuals in the forms of new grants. They waited until Proximal Origin was published, but once it was published, each one of these individuals, they got a huge amount of grants. And I believe it was either 50 or 55 million in aggregate in new grants that were given to them.
Yeah, no, that's right. I get so frustrated that all this information is out there. By the way, another part of that is that after President Trump took away Daszak's grant for the Wuhan lab, by the way, that was in April of 2020. That was, of course, absolutely necessary, despite the media outcry. Oh, you took away the grant of the guy who's going to find a cure. You know, what absolute rubbish. It's the exact opposite is true. Anyway, Fauci just quietly sat there, and 2 months later, he gave Daszak the money back plus double. He gave him double what Trump took away. And that I find so frustrating, that the corruption is in plain sight, and it's in plain sight across the board, everywhere. And we talk about the media kind of losing a bit of control of the narrative, the fact that there's people like us talking about it, that there's people online talking about it, and so on. Yeah, I think, you know, it's starting to make a difference, but we are far, far from being there. If you talk to people in the streets, they don't know, you know, about the fact that these guys got so much money, or that Daszak got his money back double, and, you know, all this other stuff we talked about. So the media has lost a bit of control, but not critically enough. I mean, they are still running the sort of the narrative, and you can just see it. By the way, coming back to that New York Times story about, well, it's not a New York Times story. It's the revelation by the New York Times reporter that he was allegedly duped. That one revelation, which, you know, we've proven to be false, he was not duped. But the fact that he said he was duped, that's now made lots and lots of news headlines in all kinds of other media outlets, because they believed it and they think it's newsworthy. But that tells you two things. I mean, number one, that how gullible they are, even the sort of the good ones. But number two, it tells you how much control anything that has the label New York Times attached to it still has.
Well, and I think the fact of the people behind the New York Times, how good they are at controlling these narratives. And, you know, they know when to give an inch and exactly how much to give in terms of, okay, it's now okay to say you were duped, right? Now, you can't admit any more than that, but you can say that. And that's kind of what happens. And by the time the truth finally emerges, the full truth, well, maybe that never happens. But by the time the majority of the truth comes out, it's so old that nobody cares anymore. And, you know, I think it's so frustrating that people like us, you know, you mentioned that this stuff was out there and was public. And that is exactly what drives us nuts, because we found it all. We're just two guys. We're not professional journalists of background. We come from very different backgrounds. Mine's one of finance, yours as a lawyer. And yet we were able to find all this stuff without any great problem, and we continue to find things. It's readily available if they wanted it to be, but it's clear they don't want it to be. And as you said, this new narrative of duped is demonstrably false. It's what that is that's the next step in the narrative. That's all that is. This is a continuation of their complicity in promoting narratives.
Yeah, it's a hoax about a hoax.
It's a hoax about a hoax. Yep. A designed hoax about a hoax.